Hello everybody, I'm some loudmouth on the internet with an opinion. What is the scariest movie you have ever seen? And what's more, what is it that you really deep down fear the most? Most scary movies use as their foil some kind of monster or sinister force, which is still effective in evoking mankind's inherent fear of the unknown that is rooted in our evolutionary history. But ultimately, such fears are irrational, since there are no monsters living under your bed, no devils in the darkness, just the unknown of the darkness itself. Why fear the unknown when there's so much we know exists that can bring about our destruction? What is there to fear most in the real world? How about this? Imagine a scenario where you live your life with a gun pointed at your head, and the only thing protecting you is that you also have a gun pointed at your opponent's head, and both of you know that if you pull the trigger, it will kill your opponent, but will also inevitably result in your death. Imagine living your entire life like this. Well, I hate to tell you this, but if you're under the age of 70, you have lived your entire life with a gun pointed right at your head. It's known as mutually assured destruction, and it has been the steady state of affairs for our entire lives, where enough weapons that are capable of destroying every single person we know, capable of destroying all complex life on this planet, have been pointed at us. And the only thing that have been protecting us is that we also have our own bombs pointed at them. But what would it look like if somebody were to push that big red button? Someone were to let those bombs fly. What would the end result really look like? Well, in 1984, a BBC docudrama decided to try to put to screen exactly what that would entail. A movie that remains the scariest movie I have ever seen in my life. That movie being known as Threads. Threads begins with two young people, Jimmy and Ruth, who are getting ready to start their lives together as Ruth finds out she's pregnant with Jimmy's baby. Sadly for this couple, this happens at a time where the world around them is slowly headed to a disaster of world-ending proportions, as we hear in the background that the situation between the United States and the Soviet Union is reaching its breaking point as the two nations begin battling over a dispute over a Soviet invasion of Iran. Really amazing just how little global affairs have changed over the years, isn't it? Throughout the beginning, you hear rumblings of greater world events on the radio and in television snippets, while our main characters try to simply move on with their lives and hope for the best.
It's getting serious. Well, there's not we can do about it, is there? Might as well enjoy ourselves whilst we can.
No, but don't it scare you what it might lead to?
It only bloody scares me. There's no we can do about it, is there? Tell you one thing, if the bomb does drop, I want to be pissed out of my mind and straight underneath it when it happens.
This makes our characters very relatable. How many times have you heard about something horrible happening on the news, felt powerless to do anything about it, and then simply tried to put it out of your mind and move on with your life? This is the situation that every common man feels at one point or another. It's not that you don't care, it's just that for your own sanity, all you can really do is try to hope for the best, even if you really can't do anything about it. Sadly, over time, the situation continues to get worse and worse, which leads to protests erupting in the streets. The government starts enacting emergency powers, preparing for what's to come. This situation continues to deteriorate until at one point Ruth breaks down while trying to refurbish her new apartment, asking herself the question that most of the audience is asking. If a nuclear war is imminent, what's the point of this?
If you move, the authorities in the new place...
You, the audience, know exactly what's coming, but that doesn't make it any less heartbreaking when it does. Inevitably, the Soviet Union decides to strike, launching a massive worldwide nuclear war between the NATO powers, the Soviet Union, and its allies. And of course, Great Britain isn't spared as dozens of nuclear weapons hit the nation. This scene is horrific enough to be the climax of almost any movie, but for Threads, we have barely gotten started. Threads follows up this with the most realistic portrayal of the aftermath of such a conflict ever put to the screen, as we see people dealing with firestorms, fallout dust, radiation sickness, and constant death and destruction. What really makes it stick with you is how the narration of this movie presents everything in as unemotional and matter-of-fact way as it possibly can. Facts are read in a rather monotone way, like you're listening to a college lecture.
In the grim economics of the aftermath, there are two harsh realities. A survivor who can work gets more food than one who can't, and the more who die, the more food is left for the rest. The entire peacetime resources of the British Health Service, even if they survived, would be unable to cope with the effects of even the single bomb that's hit Sheffield.
And other than the beginning, you hear no background music or any emotional manipulation, only the desolate sound of the cold wind blowing. Or the terrified voices of human suffering. Watching this movie is an incredibly draining experience that really leaves you feeling sick and disturbed. But not because it tells you how to feel as a lesser movie would. It lets the events before you really speak for themselves. Hell, look how it portrays the first Christmas after the attack. I guess Santa ain't coming this year. But the real question you might be asking is, what makes Threads unique among many other movies that have portrayed the horror of the bomb? Threads is often compared with another television drama depicting a full-scale nuclear war between the NATO West and the Soviet Union called The Day After. Released a year before Threads, in 1983, The Day After is an American production set in the middle of Kansas. Similar to Threads, it also follows several ordinary middle Americans as they hear about a conflict brewing between the two superpowers, which leads to an attack. The Day After is also a really good movie on its own, featuring some great Hollywood talent and a much bigger budget than Threads, which allowed the production to have far more technically proficient nuclear war sequences, as well as better makeup effects to show the effects of radiation sickness. Threads relies on cheaper tomato juice and bandages for its victims, and its nuclear war attack shows obvious stock footage. Yet despite these seeming advantages for The Day After, Threads is widely considered the superior of the two movies, and the more realistic portrayal of the aftermath of a nuclear war. Why is that? The biggest thing is The Day After ignored one of the bomb's worst effects. That is atmospheric cooling known as a nuclear winter.
Hanging in the atmosphere, the clouds of debris shut out the sun's heat and light. Across large areas of the northern hemisphere, it starts to get dark. It starts to get cold. In the centers of large land masses like America or Russia, the temperature drop may be severe, as much as 25 degrees centigrade. Even in Britain, within days of the attack, it could fall to freezing or below for long, dark periods.
While it's tempting to think that the bomb's worst effects would come during the attack, in reality the long-term effects of a nuclear war would actually be far more devastating than even the explosions themselves. In Threads, we see the horrible effects in graphic detail, as we see countless succumb to the horrors of the nuclear winter. Even when the sunlight eventually appears, the bomb's damage to the ozone layer creates ultraviolet light that makes it impossible to even go out in the sun without protection. The movie's director, Mick Jackson, consulted Carl Sagan, as well as researched a number of scientific papers on the subject to make sure he got all his science correct. And many decades later, no one's been able to find any evidence that anything in this movie is in any way exaggerated. Hell, recent studies show that even a small-scale nuclear war, like that could potentially happen between India and Pakistan, could cool the planet's climate in devastating ways. And keep in mind, these nations' nuclear capabilities come nowhere close to the US and Russia, who together control 98% of the world's nuclear weapons. The Day After really attempts to be a tribute to the spirit of Middle America, as we see survivors trying to pull themselves together to get through.
Listen to me. We need your help. This is a hospital. Those of you not seriously ill or injured have to work. Work with our staff. Now, this work will be dangerous. We have to do it. in order to survive.
Threads, on the other hand, shows pretty much all attempts to manage the post-war world as futile, as we see the remains of the government quickly turn to brutal methods to contain the chaos. It shows the government becoming largely tyrannical, but not really out of any kind of inhuman malice, per se, but simply because the situation before them is simply too much for anyone to control. While The Day After shows a hospital with working lights that's only relatively overwhelmed, Threads shows us a dark hospital covered in dirt and blood, where amputations without anesthesia are performed and the vast majority of the sick and the dying go untreated. While The Day After doesn't portray nuclear war as any picnic, there is a sense at the end of The Day After that there is some hope that humanity will be able to pull together, rebuild, and survive this. Threads, on the other hand, does everything it can to rob you of any of that delusional hope. Where Threads is really extra devastating is how far forward it goes, going 10 and eventually 13 years after the attack, showing society in no better shape than immediately after. And that's the main reason why Threads was made, to attack the perception that nuclear war in any way could ever be won by anybody.
This time, they are playing with, at best, the destruction of life as we know it, and at worst, total annihilation. You cannot win a nuclear war!
The message of Threads is really simple. In a nuclear war, everyone loses. But beyond that, the scenes that disturbed me the most were the depiction of the next generation of children born after the attack.
One day, Satan and Conan. Ethan! Elf O'Brien!
Best stand officer again!
Ethan!
It shows that the bomb's radiation would have horrific effects on any fetuses conceived after the attack, and the harsh life that these children grew up in gave them no time to learn proper language. This depiction of the human race being set back 1,000,000 years in a single generation was probably the thing that disturbed me most about this movie. Nothing in The Day After or any other movie disturbed me as much as this. Threads is a difficult watch due to the movie's shocking cruelty, mostly through the point of view of Ruth, who could be any young woman in the audience or anyone's sister or mother. We see her lose the man she loves in the attack, and then the rest of her family. Then a few months after the attack, she's forced to give birth to her child alone in an abandoned barn, while a guard dog barks at her. This scene of a child being born is one of the most depressing, as both Ruth as well as the audience can only pity that baby being born into such a nightmarish hellscape. Yet Ruth continues to fight on, working hard every day to find food for her baby, and at one point even prostituting herself in exchange for 4 dead rats. How is she rewarded for all this? 10 years after the attack, we see her with her daughter, working trying to scrape any kind of living out of the soil. With no fertilizers or agrochemicals, they have to try their hardest for even the tiniest bit of food. Ruth eventually collapses, and from her harsh life we see that she has aged well past her years. She dies there while her daughter she sacrificed everything for doesn't even seem to even care, due to her mental disabilities as the result of the radiation, and or simply because dying is such a routine part of the world she grew up in, she is completely numb to it. Ruth dies next to her book on birds she kept only because it was the last thing she had to remind her of the man she once loved. Like I said, harsh and cruel. But this is another example of a movie that's cruel for all the right reasons. Sometimes people need shocking examples to shock them out of apathy. It's why The Day After was so foolish to hold back. What's the point of a nuclear war movie if you're not going to show the worst of it? Threads is a much better movie because it wasn't afraid to show the worst. Threads was not afraid to shock the audience. It put all the horrors that could happen right in your face. Don't want to see parents finding their dead son in the rubble? Too bad! Don't want to see a mom clutching the burnt corpse of her baby? Too bad! Don't want to see mentally deformed, irradiated teenagers raping each other in a world without society or rules? Too bad! Threads isn't afraid to shock you, but nothing here is shock value just for the sake of it. All the shock value is there to make you think about the system of mutually assured destruction that we so blissfully live every single day of our lives under. A system that shows absolutely no signs of changing. That leads to another question. Why is this movie called Threads? The movie explains its title in the opening narration.
In an urban society, everything connects. Each person's needs are fed by the skills of many others. Our lives are woven together in a fabric. But the connections that make society strong also make it vulnerable.
Our society has so many interconnecting services that make our lives run so smoothly. The store is chock full of affordable food because modern farming technology allows it to be farmed so cheaply. But this relies on a huge number of things. Fertile soil, a climate that has a long growing season, and energy production that give us the tools to farm it. An interconnected web of threads that hold society together. But what if a nuclear war destroys the energy industry? A climate shift shortens the growing period, and fallout destroys the fertile soil. What happens when the threads of society are cut? One movie wasn't afraid to show us. But you might be thinking, this movie has to be exaggerating. No way anything this bad could possibly really have ever happened. This movie's just fear-mongering. If you believe that, you probably don't know just how close this movie became to becoming reality. In early 1983, a defect in the Soviet Union's early warning system created a false alarm that American nuclear missiles were headed to Russia, and this very nearly triggered a retaliatory strike that would have led to a full-scale nuclear war. A man named Stanislav Petrov made the snap judgment after going over the readings that the alarm was false and gave his men orders to stand down. Today, Mr. Petrov is known as the man who saved the world, and is often regarded as a hero. But really think about just how scary that story is. If a man with lesser judgment that day had been in his position, Threads would not just be a movie I'm reviewing on the internet. Threads would be the reality that we all live in today, if any of us lived at all. But you now might be thinking, well, even if that fear was valid, even if all this could have happened, well, the 80s are over. The Cold War has ended. Clearly, the fear of this has passed. Think again. In reality, relations between the West and Russia are worse than they've been in decades, and the doomsday clock is closer to midnight than it has been in many, many years. Not to mention the increasing nuclear tensions between Iran, North Korea, and many other states.
Under my administration, we will never apologize for advancing America's interests. For example, decades ago, the United States entered into a treaty with Russia in which we agreed to limit and reduce our missile capability. While we followed the agreement and the rules to the letter, Russia repeatedly violated its terms. It's been going on for many years. That is why I announced that the United States is officially withdrawing from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. Perhaps
we are pretty much seeing the beginnings of a second Cold War. If you are under the age of 30, chances of a nuclear war are higher today than they have been at any point in your lifetime. Which leads to another question. What if this has all happened before? What if this is the answer to Fermi's paradox? The Fermi's paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, asked the question that if the universe is old enough for intelligent races to have evolved countless millions of years ago, then intelligent races should have had more than enough time to colonize the galaxy. So then, where is everybody? Why does our galaxy not seem to have been colonized by alien intelligence? Why, after decades of listening to the cosmos, have we gotten nothing but a great silence when we should theoretically be bathed in extraterrestrial signals? Many different theories have been offered to explain this paradox, But the darkest answer to that question is, maybe we haven't found any aliens because maybe they're all dead. Maybe it's the natural course of any and all civilizations that as soon as they become advanced enough to figure out E equals MC squared, that maybe they inevitably destroy themselves in nuclear holocaust. In the animal kingdom today, predators tend to be more intelligent than herbivores. Foxes and wolves are smarter than rabbits, for example. It's also believed that eating meat helped fuel the evolution of our brain, so it's probable most alien intelligences will also most likely have evolved from predators. Maybe ancient predatory instinct mixed with modern scientific knowledge on how to build nuclear weapons just inevitably leads to destruction and extinction. Maybe this has happened countless millions of times throughout the cosmos, and we're just next on the chopping block. It may not happen in our lifetime, but maybe a few more centuries of mutually assured destruction, maybe it's just inevitable that eventually someone just a little bit too skittish will have his hand on the big red button and make that terrible decision to press it. Maybe, who knows, some religious extremist will get his hands on nuclear weapons and think that launching a nuclear war will bring about his vision of paradise. It could be more a matter of when rather than if. The best hope we have as a society to stop such a thing from ever happening is to envision it. Apathy is lethal. False complacency is lethal. And that's why movies like Threads are so important. Threads exist to help you imagine the unimaginable. Threads shoves its grim reality right into your face. Threads never holds your hand and tells you that everything will be okay. You don't have to watch it, of course, but the world doesn't disappear when you close your eyes. And the events in this movie don't become less likely just because you choose to not think about them. Threads is truly the scariest movie I've ever seen. Its grim and cruel as can be portrayal of the nightmare of a nuclear war is like nothing else ever put to cinema. Threads holds nothing back. Threads is willing to scare you for a good cause, not just because it can. The entire point of the emotion of fear is to protect you. It's fear that keeps us from engaging in destructive behavior. It's fear that keeps us alive. It's why Threads isn't just a great movie, it's an important movie. And it isn't just the scariest movie I've ever seen, but also one of the most important movies ever made. It's one more people really need to see. Forgive me for this rather dark and depressing video, but if it really convinces more people to watch this movie and really understand its message, it'll all be worth it. My advice, buy it. Buy Threads on Blu-ray. I'll even leave a link below in the description where you can. Buy it and show it to your friends and family, and do everything you can to make sure this doesn't happen. In order to stop the future, you must first envision the future. Envision the possible future of Threads, and make sure it doesn't come to pass. I'm some Loudmouth on the internet. You just heard my opinion. So thanks to the Dark Conservatarian, Connor Johnson, and my other awesome patrons. And be sure to subscribe for more Loudmouth reviews, commentaries, and editorials.